I have been asked, more than once, to explain what happened on Geneva Orbital in the autumn of my 43rd year. The question comes from journalists, from Concord security officers, from the quieter men who do not show credentials, and whose questions feel less like curiosity and more like measurement. I have given depositions that ran 12 hours each. I have sat in front of panels of beings whose biology I could not fully read, watching secondary eyelids lower and raise while I tried to describe events that did not fit neatly into any existing category of Concord law or protocol. I have watched alien committee members lean their broad gray-green heads together and confer in frequencies I cannot hear. And I have learned to wait while they confer, to hold the silence without filling it, which is a skill I developed in self-defense over 20 years of being the only human in rooms full of beings who thought waiting was weakness. I always answer the same way. I say I am a physicist. I understood the problem in the only language I have ever trusted, and I solved it. They write it down. They nod. Shh. They adjust their recording devices and clear their throats and proceed to the next question. And I can tell from the next question that my answer has not clarified anything. They are still looking for the decision point. They want to know when I chose, which path I took, at what moment the situation resolved from ambiguous to clear, from multiple possibilities to a single outcome. They ask, always, but how did you know which choice was real? And I tell them I didn't. That's precisely why it worked. They do not understand that answer. I have come to believe they cannot, and not because they are unintelligent. Most of them are extremely intelligent. They cannot understand it because the framework they use to model decision-making assumes, at its foundation, that a decision is a collapse, that a person facing two paths eventually picks one and abandons the other, and that the moment of picking is the moment of resolution. Framework has served their civilization for a very long time. It is a good framework. It has produced 2 centuries of Concord stability, a body of science that dwarfs anything humanity managed before the contact, and a system of law and governance that is, by most measurable standards, more sophisticated and more just than anything we built alone. It simply cannot model me. Let me start at the beginning. Not the very beginning. Not the childhood on Kepler station adjacent Earth, where I grew up reading physics primers, meant for adults and asking my teachers questions they could not answer. Not the university years in Freiburg where I first encountered the Vorathi theoretical canon and understood simultaneously that it was the most sophisticated physics I had ever seen, and that something in it was wrong. Not the decade of teaching and paper writing and careful institutional navigation that had brought me to a joint species faculty position at the Concord Academy in Jena. Start where it mattered. Start with Nick. Nick was 8 years old that autumn. Thin kid, serious face. The kind of boy who asks too many questions in precisely the right order. He had his mother Mikey's jaw and her tendency to go quiet when something delighted her, instead of making noise the way most children do. And he had my habit of stopping in the middle of sentences, because something more interesting had occurred to me, which drove Mikey quietly insane, but which she bore with the patience of a woman who had chosen her life carefully and chosen well. Nick was, in every meaningful sense, the best thing I had produced in 4 decades of existence, on this or any other world. And I say that as a man who had published a monograph on branching quantum geometries that the Vorathi Academy of Theoretical Science had called quaint, a word they use when they mean incorrect, but do not wish to engage in the argument. Perhaps Mikey's idea. She was a keen cyclist, 3-time finisher of the Jena to Orbital Relay, which is a punishing 3-day event that covers 2 pressurized corridors and a zero-gravity crossing that most serious athletes skip entirely. She had booked a mountain range traverse on Kepler-4 that was going to take 3 weeks. High altitude, technical terrain, the kind of trip she had been planning for 2 years and which I had encouraged because I loved watching her prepare for things she cared about. And also, if I am being honest, because the timing coincided with a 2-week window in which the branching geometry proof might finally be close enough to complete that continuous uninterrupted work could bring it home. Nick needed somewhere to be. The camp she found was a joint species wilderness program on the eastern plateau of Jena Station's outer ring. Established 11 years ago, consistently safe, Roughly 200 children of 4 different species spread across 6 supervised cohort groups. Were trained in emergency response and xenobiology and cross-species conflict de-escalation and a dozen other disciplines that made the brochure feel more like a military operational brief than a summer itinerary. Nick had been asking to go for 2 years, ever since one of his classmates described the night sky mapping sessions. There was apparently a Drelhari counselor who could see 3 additional spectral bands and who ran astronomy sessions where she described what the stars looked like from her side of the spectrum, and Nick had decided that this information was important to acquire. I was not paying close enough attention to any of it. That is the truth I have never tried to soften in any of the depositions, and I will not soften it here. What I was paying attention to was my proof. I had been working on the branching geometries paper for 6 years. Not 6 years of full-time effort, 6 years of nights and early mornings, and the 40 minutes between my last lecture and the walk home. The kind of slow accumulation that only a man with a day job and a family fully understands. It is a different rhythm than pure research. Slower, more interrupted, but in certain ways also more generative. Because the interruptions force you to put the work down and live an actual life. And sometimes when you pick it back up, you can see it from a distance that proximity had been hiding. I had made 3 of my most significant conceptual breakthroughs. After long periods of not thinking about the paper at all, I had made 2 of them while watching Nick sleep. The proof was nearly there. Could feel the architecture of it the way you feel a wall that is solid before you actually press your hand against it and find the crack. I needed 2 weeks, uninterrupted. No lectures, no administrative obligations. No dinners with colleagues who wanted to debate the standard collapse model, with the polite condescension of people who have decided you are wrong, but are too careful to say so directly. Kate leaving, Nick going to camp. The apartment empty, the whiteboard mine, 2 weeks of consecutive thought. I drove Nick to the transport hub myself. Old ground vehicle, the kind Mike called a relic, and I called sufficient. The roads on Jaina Station's inner ring were never crowded at that hour. The morning transit rush ran in the opposite direction, toward the academic district and the administrative node. And we had a clear run the whole way, which I noticed but did not particularly appreciate, because I was thinking about a section of the proof that had been bothering me for 3 days. Nick talked the whole way. He wanted to know if there would be Drelhari kids at the camp, because he had read that Drelhari could see into the near-infrared spectrum, and he wanted to ask them what orange looked like from their side. I said probably yes, there usually were. He thought about that for 3 kilometers, watching the station infrastructure slide past the window, the precious corridor walls, the maintenance walkways, the occasional shimmer of a garden section's UV emitters coming on for the morning cycle. Then he said, whether a color that only one species can see is still a color or just information. I said that was a very good question, and I wasn't sure. He seemed satisfied with this, in the way only children are satisfied with honest uncertainty from adults. He went quiet for the last 2 kilometers, and I thought he had moved on, but as I pulled into the transport hub forecourt, he said, very carefully, I think it's still a color. The Immerchange version and the color version are both real at the same time, like they don't cancel each other out. I parked the vehicle. I looked at my 8-year-old son. That, I said, is actually an interesting way to think about it. He shrugged like he knew that, and didn't need me to confirm it, which was characteristic, and got out of the vehicle to collect his bag from the back. I carried it inside. We found his cohort group, 22 children, 7 species, 2 human counselors, and 1 enormous Kethal, who stood 2 meters tall and apparently specialized in geological survey, and had never worked with children before, but was reportedly very good at it. Nick checked in. He put on his cohort band. He looked at me with that particular expression he had, the one that was not quite a smile, but contained all the information a smile would have conveyed, and then he walked through the gate to join his group without looking back, which I found both admirable. If I am honest about the feeling I had standing in that hub watching him go, a small private grief. I stopped at a fuel station on the way back. I needed to refuel the vehicle, and I also, if I am being honest, Needed to stand in the open air of the pressurized corridor for a moment before going back to an apartment that was about to be very empty in two different directions simultaneously. The station was a commercial stop, fuel, food, a small maintenance bay. 30-meter walk from the vehicle to the service block. 90 seconds inside at most. I came back outside and the vehicle was where I had left it. Nick was not. The back door was closed. His bag was gone. The seat was empty in the way that seats are empty when they have been empty for longer than 90 seconds. That particular quality of absence that takes a moment to register, and then does not stop registering. It is not like noticing a missing object. It is more structural than that. The shape of the space where a person was is different from the shape of a space that has never contained a person, and my nervous system, which had spent 8 years calibrating itself to the specific physical presence of one small boy, registered the difference before my conscious mind had finished processing what it was seeing. I stood there for what must have been 15 seconds but felt geological in scale. The way certain moments do when your brain is running faster than the clock. Checked the vehicle, back seat, footwell, trunk. I looked at the fuel station forecourt. I walked 15 meters in each direction on the corridor. I looked at the corridor feed monitors, which showed me my own back, and the empty forecourt, but nothing useful. Then my comm unit chimed. The voice that came through it was Vorathi. I recognized the tonal pattern immediately. The harmonic doubling in the mid-register that the translation layer does not fully eliminate. The precise vowel lengths that have always reminded me of a tuning fork struck against cold glass. The slight delay between word groups that comes from real-time cross-species. Translation even in a system as sophisticated as the Concord standard. The translation layer rendered it in flat, clean Concord standard. The voice artificially neutralized. Professor Vidich, your son is safe. He will remain safe provided you comply with a single instruction. You have 24 hours to consider it. We will contact you again. The line went dead. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters to the story, and I think it has been misrepresented in some of the reporting. Not panic. Not the hot animal fear I would have expected if I had ever been asked to predict my own response to this situation. What I felt was a strange cold lateral shift, as if the ground beneath me had moved 6 centimeters to the left, and everything I had built on it had moved with it, faithfully, without breaking. So that everything still looked the same, but I was standing somewhere slightly different from where I had been, and I could feel with precision that the old coordinates no longer applied. My son was gone. Some wanted something from me. These two facts were connected. I called Oscar. We had been friends since the first week of university, since a seminar on wavefunction interpretation, where we were the only 2 humans in a cohort of 30 and realized within 40 minutes each other that we were also the only 2 people in the room who had read the full Vorathi canon on decoherence theory. That is a very specific kind of intellectual loneliness, and it forges a very specific kind of friendship. The kind built not on comfort or proximity, but on mutual recognition. The understanding that you are looking at a person who has mapped the same territory you have and arrived at different conclusions, and will argue about those conclusions indefinitely without losing respect for the mapper. Oscar and I had been arguing about wavefunction collapse for 23 years. We had also, in that time, shared apartments, shared grant applications, attended each other's thesis defenses, and spoken at each other's weddings. Mine to Micah, and his to a woman named Vera, who had divorced him 7 years later in a way that had left him quieter and more deliberate than he had been before. He was at the CERN installation on Geneva Orbital now, particle bridge physics, experimental cutting edge. The work that made my many worlds research look, as our mutual department head had once said, the careful diplomatic neutrality of a man who needed to maintain relationships with both of us, speculative in ways that are difficult to peer review. Oscar had always thought my proof was wrong. Not the mathematics. He had reviewed 3 iterations of the branching geometry equations and found no errors he could demonstrate, which had produced in him a specific kind of reluctant frustration that I recognized, and I confess, quietly enjoyed. He thought the mathematics was formally valid and physically meaningless. He believed in the standard collapse model, in one universe, in decisions made and branches pruned, and everything that did not happen simply ceasing to be in any meaningful sense. He thought the many worlds interpretation was a beautiful story told by equations that did not know the difference between description and reality. He had told me this for 20 years, sometimes over dinner and sometimes in published letters, and once, memorably, in front of an audience of 300 physicists at a Concord symposium in a way that had required us not to speak for 6 weeks afterward until we could both see it as characteristically him rather than as a betrayal. He answered in 2 rings. He always answered in 2 rings, which was something I had never commented on and never needed to. I told him what had happened. Flat facts, chronological order, the translation layer voice and the 24-hour window. He was quiet for a long time, longer than his usual thinking silences. Then he said, simply and without qualification, "Come to Geneva." They said 24 hours. Then you have time. Come now. I did not go to the Concord security office first. I want to explain this because it has been questioned in the depositions, framed sometimes as a failure of procedure and sometimes as suspicious in itself. The Concord security apparatus, on Jaina Station, was joint administered. Human and Vorathi officers in the same building, sharing the same chain of command and the same encrypted network. I did not know who had taken Nick. I did not know how many layers of the Concord administrative structure were involved. The call had come from a Vorathi voice, with no identification, no demands, yet nothing I could take to a security officer that constituted actionable intelligence. And I had spent 20 years working in alien-dominated academic institutions, navigating the particular politics of being human, in spaces built by and for species who regarded human intellectual tradition as junior and somewhat charming. And I had learned during those 20 years to be careful about which rooms I walked into before I understood the full shape of what was in them. I am not a paranoid man. Ask anyone who knows me. I am a precise man. Precision and paranoia are sometimes confused, but they are not the same thing. Precision means not acting on incomplete information. I had incomplete information. I needed more of it before I could act usefully. I drove back to my apartment. I stood in the front room for 11 minutes, which I know because I watched the clock on the wall rather than my comm unit, because I did not want to be distracted by comm alerts while I thought. The room was very quiet. Mike was already in transit to Kepler 4. Nick's shoes were by the door, where he had left them last night, and which I had told him to move 3 times, and which he had not moved, and I looked at them for part of those 11 minutes. Then I stopped looking at them and thought about the call. The instruction had been singular, one requirement. Prior, they had not told me what the requirement was. That was deliberate. The structure of the contact had been designed to fill the 24 hours with my imagination, to let me cycle through every bad version of the demand, to exhaust my decision-making reserves before the actual choice arrived. I recognized this architecture because it was documented. 3 papers in the Concord Journal of Cross-Species Negotiations described this exact approach, a Vorathi bilateral coercion technique that had been used in trade disputes and territorial boundary negotiations, and at least 2 academic tenure conflicts that I knew of. Present a binary. Control the variables, delay the revelation of the actual demand. Let the target collapse prematurely, spend their psychological resources on hypothetical versions of the problem, so that, when the real version arrives, they are already tired. What they were doing to me was not an abduction in the ordinary sense. It was a probability problem, presented in the language of threat. And understanding it as a probability problem, rather than as a threat, was the thing that kept me functional in those 11 minutes. Packed a bag, lecture notes, a portable terminal with my proof files locally cached, a change of clothes, a transit pod to Geneva Orbital, direct 9 hours. I left the apartment with Nick's shoes still by the door and my whiteboard still covered in 6 years of accumulated work that was suddenly, completely, beside the point of whatever the next 24 hours required of me. The transit gave me 9 hours to think. I used 7 of them for writing. Not mathematics, not equations, just words. Every fact I had, arranged and rearranged on paper in the old-fashioned way that I revert to when I need to think without the particular interference that a lit screen introduces. Who had done this? what they wanted, what I had that was worth the operational complexity of a cross-station child abduction, what leverage I possessed that could not be extracted more efficiently through the existing mechanisms of Concord academic politics, which were slow and procedural and deeply averse to anything that might generate public attention. The ob's answer kept asserting itself, and I kept examining it from different angles, looking for the way it might be wrong. And each time I came back to the same conclusion. Proof: 6 years of branching geometry. A mathematical demonstration that, if it held under experimental corroboration, established the many worlds interpretation not as an interesting theoretical possibility, but as physical fact. That every decision genuinely spawned a separate continuity. The universe was not a single corridor of cause and effect, but an infinite, exponentially expanding structure of branches. And that in principle, with sufficient understanding of the geometry, one could not only know what had happened in any given branch, but know what was simultaneously happening in adjacent ones. The Vorathi did not want that proof to exist. I spent most of an hour on the transit, letting myself believe the alternative explanations. Professional rivalry. There were human physicists who disliked me, most of them for good reasons. Some financial angle I could not see. The academic grant structure was complicated enough that motivated actors could in principle leverage it in ways that were not immediately obvious. Something personal and unrelated to the physics that I had simply failed to notice because I had been preoccupied with the proof. None of these held up. The operational complexity of what had been done, the monitoring required to know my schedule, Make's travel plans, Nick's camp drop-off, the coordination required to have someone at that fuel station at precisely the right moment, the legal and political exposure that came with abducting a human child on a Concord station. None of this was proportionate to anything, except something that represented an existential concern. The many worlds proof was an existential concern for the Vorathi, not because they feared it scientifically, but because they feared it culturally and politically. The standard collapse model was not merely a physics theory for them. It was the epistemological backbone of their civilization. Their legal codes rested on it. One truth, discoverable through rigorous analysis, applicable to all parties. Their academic hierarchy rested on it. Demonstrable correctness as the basis of rank and authority. Their method of settling dispute between species in the concord rested on it. The premise that sufficiently sophisticated analysis could always identify the objectively correct answer to any question, including questions about territory, resource allocation, and governance. My proof said, there is no objectively correct answer. There is no single state. The universe does not choose between possibilities. It instantiates all of them simultaneously. And the choosing is something that happens in the observation, in the measurement, in the consciousness that interacts with the branch. Every decision made anywhere in the physical universe is not a pruning of possibilities, but an addition to them. Tree does not lose branches. It grows more. This was not just inconvenient for Vorathi physics. It was destructive to Vorathi civilization in the same way that removing a foundation is destructive to a building. You do not have to blow up the walls. You simply remove what they are standing on. Sitting in that transit pod at 2 in the morning, with the stars, moving past the small oval window, and Nick's shoes still 300 kilometers behind me, on the floor of my apartment, that I was not dealing with kidnappers in any ordinary sense. I was dealing with a civilization that had decided my mathematics was dangerous enough to justify the kind of response that civilizations reserve for things they believe might unmake them, and they had picked the most efficient lever available. The 8-year-old boy who wanted to know whether a color was still a color when only one species could see it. Oscar met me at the Geneva orbital docking arm. He looked the way he looks when something is wrong, and he has decided that appearing calm is the most useful contribution he can make to the situation. Very still, very deliberate. His weight distributed with the particular steadiness of a large man who has decided not to use his size for anything except grounding. He was 6'1", broad across the shoulders, grayer at the temples than the last time I had seen him in person, which had been 14 months symposium at a Concord Physics Symposium, where We had both given papers and then argued about them for 3 hours over dinner. He shook my hand rather than embracing me, which was characteristic, and which I found, in that moment, exactly right. "Have you heard from them again?" he said. "Not yet." He led me through the installation. The CERN Bridge facility was the largest structure on Geneva Orbital, a carved ring of pressurized corridors around a central accelerator chamber that was, at its widest point, 3 kilometers across. The engineers had designed and built the original structure 40 years ago, working with a physics so far beyond what humanity had developed at the time that the human scientists brought in, as collaborators, had spent the first 2 years mostly trying to understand the documentation. Human physicists had been invited to participate in the research program 12 years ago, which was framed as an act of intellectual generosity and which I had argued in a paper. A paper nobody had cited was more accurately described as a calculated strategy to keep human physics development tethered to Vorathi methodological assumptions rather than developing along its own independent trajectory. Oscar had disagreed with me about that paper too. His office was on level 7, with a long window that looked out over the accelerator ring. You could see the faint shimmer of the containment field if the light was right, and you knew what you were looking at. A blue-white coherence, very faint, like the memory of lightning preserved in glass. I had always found it beautiful in the way that very powerful things are beautiful, which is not safely and not easily, but with a particular clarity that comes from knowing exactly what you are looking at and exactly what it can do. He made coffee, black, strong, the way we had both drunk it since the first week of university, when we had the campus cafeteria stayed open until 3 in the morning, and that a large pot of coffee and 6 hours of argument constituted an acceptable substitute for sleep. He sat across from me and folded his hands on the table in the deliberate way he has when he is about to say something he has been rehearsing. And then he did not say it. He waited. This was unusual. Oscar was not a patient listener by habit or inclination. He was the kind of person who finishes your sentences, not because he is rude, but because his brain is already 3 exchanges ahead and waiting for you to catch up. "Tell me the whole thing," he said. I told him. Everything I knew. Everything I had worked out on the transit. Every piece of the structural analysis laid out in the order I had arrived at it. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was still for a long time, and then he said something that surprised me enough that I had to revise my sense of what the conversation was going to be. "You might be right," he said. "The proof being why." "I know I'm right about the proof. I mean about why they took him." He paused. He looked at his coffee rather than at me, which meant he was saying something that cost him something to say. "I've been noticing things in the bridge datasets. Anomalies that I cannot explain within the standard collapse model. The kind of signatures that would be explicable if..." He stopped. He started again. "I've been seeing things in the data that I should have reported 8 months ago and did not." I looked at him. "Because I thought it would pass," he said. "Because the standard model has worked for 2 centuries, and I have built my career on it, and I did not want to be the person who filed a report saying that a theoretical framework I have spent 20 years publicly dismissing might in fact be correct." He looked at me then. "I was protecting my reputation. I want you to know that I am telling you that plainly." This was not what I had come to Geneva to hear, but it mattered in ways he could not yet know, and I filed it carefully and precisely alongside everything else I had been filing. "How significant are the anomalies?" I asked. "They're faint, at the edge of what the current measurement array can detect. The kind of reading you dismiss as instrument noise until you have a conversation like this one, and you realize you have been actively looking for reasons to dismiss it for 8 months. What would make them unambiguous?" I said. "Specifically, not more data in the same configuration. What configuration would take them from suggestive to definitive?" He looked at me with the expression he has when he realizes I have jumped 3 steps ahead and he is catching up. "Are you thinking?" "Answer the question first." He thought for precisely 3 seconds. I know Oscar's thinking silences, and I know their durations. 3 seconds means he is running mathematics in his head. "A simultaneous bilateral measurement," he said, "both sides of a split point, at the exact moment of decoherence. Not before, not after. The measurement has to capture both branches at the instant they separate. And the bridge can do that? In principle. B. The measurement array would need to be reconfigured to bilateral mode, which is not a standard operational state. It was considered in the original design and rejected on the grounds that there was no theoretical reason to want it, and you would need to know where the split point was going to occur. In advance, within a microsecond. He said this with the tone of someone describing an impossibility as a way of demonstrating that the thing I was thinking could not work. Proof, I said, includes a predictive geometry for decoherence events. Given sufficient input parameters about a physical system, it produces decoherence coordinates, when and where a split point will occur, to within a microsecond. He was very still for a moment. Proof has never been experimentally tested, I said, because there has never been a measurement instrument sensitive enough to test it at the necessary resolution. The CERN bridge in bilateral configuration is sensitive enough. You want to run the experiment, he said, tonight. Instead to complying with the demand, before the demand arrives. My comm unit chimed. Same voice, the harmonic doubling, the translation layer, the cold glass precision. Flat and formal, and entirely without weight, which is the most disturbing register a voice can take when it is telling you about your child. Professor Vittich, you have arrived at Geneva Orbital. That is acceptable. The requirement is as follows. Dr. Oscar Hoyer has, over the past 8 months, accumulated data in the CERN Bridge Research Archive that corroborates certain aspects of your theoretical framework. That data exists on the CERN Research Network in encrypted storage under his authorization credentials. You will destroy it, not archive, not transfer, not compress or obscure, destroy. The destruction must be confirmed by network erasure logs, which we are in a position to verify. You have 12 hours from this communication. When the destruction is confirmed, contact us at this channel, and your son will be returned to Jaina Station within 2 hours. A pause. Counted 6 seconds. If you do not comply, the boy will not be harmed. He will simply remain where he is. Indefinitely. You will not find him. We have the resources and the patience to ensure this outcome for as long as necessary. The line went dead. I set the comm unit on Oscar's desk. The room was very quiet. I watched Oscar's face as he processed what he had just heard. The shift from still to very still that happens when a large, deliberate man receives information that is worse than what he was prepared for. His hands were flat on the table. He did not move them. They've been monitoring the network, he said. 8 months. At minimum. They know what's in my encrypted archive. They know it exists. They may or may not know its contents. The existence is enough. He stood up. He walked to the window. He stood with his back to me, looking at the accelerator ring below, and the blue-white shimmer of the containment field that was visible from here when you knew what you were looking at. And I watched the particular set of his shoulders that meant he was making a decision about something that was going to cost him more than the decision itself. I can delete the files, he said. His voice was even. Right now. From this terminal. 10 minutes. I know. Nick comes home. Yes. You lose the corroborating data. 8 months of anomaly signatures. Yes. He turned around. Is there another path? That was the question I had been running since the transit pod. That was the reason I had called him from the fuel station instead of anyone else. The reason I had come to Geneva, specifically, rather than staying on Gina and working the problem from there. Not because he could delete the files. Any authorized researcher could do that. Because he was the only person alive who might understand the other path. And because the other path required me to be right about something I had never proven in an experimental context, and would now have to prove in 12 hours, in a particle bridge facility that had never been configured for the measurement, inside a crisis that was designed to exhaust my decision-making capacity before I could think clearly about any of this. Sit down, I said, and don't argue with me until I've finished. He sat down. He folded his hands again. He waited, which cost him something, and I noted that. The standard collapse model says one reality, I said. Decision made, branch pruned, everything that did not happen ceases to be. That model is what the Vorathi have built their science on, and their civilization on, and their coercion tactics on, their method of managing threats. And that is what this is. A threat management protocol. Works exactly like the physics they believe in. present a binary, control the variables, create conditions under which the target will collapse to one of the two options and stay there. They are very good at this. They have been doing it for 2 centuries. Sebastian, I said, don't argue. The model they are using to predict my behaviors assumes I am a single universe machine. It assumes that facing a binary, delete the data or never see Nick again, I will collapse to one choice and execute it. That is what they expect. That is the only behavior their framework can model. You're going to tell me your many worlds proof changes this. My many worlds proof describes what the universe actually does. The universe, when faced with a binary, does not choose. It instantiates both. Both branches become real. The choosing is something that happens in the observer, in the measurement, not in the system itself. You are not the universe, no. But I am a human being who has spent 40 years thinking about this problem and the cognitive habit of holding multiple possibilities simultaneously, of refusing to collapse prematurely, of keeping the wave function open until the last possible moment. This is not a metaphor for me. It is a description of how I actually think. It is how I have always thought. It is how, I suspect, most humans think, even the ones who have never heard of wave function mechanics. Because we evolved on a planet that required us to hold multiple threat models simultaneously and decide between them at the last possible moment when the most information was available. Oscar was very still. The accelerator ring hummed below us, not quite audible through the window, but present as a vibration in the floor. The Vorathi built a coercion trap for a creature that collapses early, I said. I do not collapse early. I am going to hold both options open, delete the files, or run the experiment, and I am going to keep both of them open for as long as is operationally possible, and I am going to let the situation develop and collect more information, and only collapse to a choice at the moment when not choosing would produce a worse outcome than any available choice. And Nick is safe during this time because they have explicitly stated he will not be harmed, because harming him would create political and legal noise that is inconsistent with their evident operational goal, which is the quiet suppression of inconvenient mathematics. And because I believe them when they say they have the resources and the patience to hold him indefinitely, which means they have factored a long timeline into their operational planning, which means they are not operating under time pressure, which means their threat is real and their stated terms are real, and I can trust the structure of the offer, even if I cannot trust their goodwill. That is a cold calculation. I know it is. I am also aware that if I am wrong about any part of it, the consequences are not recoverable. I am holding that awareness, and I am setting it aside because it is not useful information. It is just weight. He held my gaze for a long time. Outside the window, the containment field pulsed once, slowly, beautifully, the way it does when the ring cycles its calibration sequence. What would you need from me? He said. 6 hours to reconfigure the measurement array to bilateral mode. Your decoherence anomaly data to calibrate the bridge against my predictive geometry. And your word that if the experiment comes back ambiguous, you delete the files in the morning, and we contact them, and Nick comes home. You'd still have time. The 12-hour window. If the measurement is ambiguous, I delete the files and we bring Nick home. Full stop. I am not using Nick as a theoretical gamble. I am using Nick as a weight that sits on one side of a scale, and I am adding weight to the other side of the scale. And if the other side gets heavy enough in the next 12 hours, it will lift him clear. If it doesn't, he comes home on their terms. Oscar looked at me for a long time. Then, he pushed back from the table, stood up, and walked to the equipment terminal on the far wall. He pulled up the bridge control interface. He said, without turning around, "You know what frustrates me most about this conversation?" "What?" I've spent 20 years explaining to anyone who would listen why the many worlds interpretation is a beautiful story, that the mathematics is telling us about itself rather than about physical reality. He pulled up the bilateral measurement specifications from the design archive, the configuration that had been rejected 40 years ago as theoretically unnecessary, and I have not been able to explain in 20 years why the anomaly data I have been collecting for 8 months looks exactly like what your proof says it should look like. He turned around. Let's start the reconfiguration. We worked through the night, 7 hours of detailed, careful engineering work. The kind that cannot be rushed, because rushing it would introduce the precise calibration errors that would make the result ambiguous, which would make everything we were doing pointless. Oscar moved through the bridge control systems with the fluency of a man who had spent 12 years learning every instrument in the facility, making adjustments with a sureness that I found both reassuring and quietly humbling, because he was better at this than I was, and I had always known it. I worked the theoretical geometry on a secondary terminal, feeding decoherence coordinates into the bridge targeting architecture, working backward from my predictive equations to the specific measurement parameters the bilateral array would need to capture the event I expected. The Vorathi engineering documentation for the bridge was meticulous and thorough and written entirely with standard collapse framework, which meant that several of the calibration assumptions embedded in the control software were wrong from the perspective of what I was trying to do. I found 3 of these embedded errors in the first 2 hours and fixed them. Oscar found 2 more that I had missed. We did not discuss this. There were moments when I thought the geometry was wrong, when the coordinates I had predicted failed to resolve against the bridge's existing calibration in a way that suggested a fundamental error in the predictive equations rather than a calibration problem. Each time I stopped, went back to the proof, found the source of the discrepancy, corrected it. Each time Oscar waited without commenting. He had learned, in 23 years, that my working silences were not interruptions to our shared work, but a different part of the same work, and interrupting them cost time. I had never told him I was grateful for this. Some things accrue over years in the gaps between words. At 0340 station time, Oscar ran the final calibration check. He looked at the readout. He looked at me. He said, "Ready." Decoherence event predicted at 0412. That's 32 minutes. We sat down. We drank the last of the cold coffee. The bridge hummed around and below us. That subsonic presence that lives at the edge of perception, the specific physical signature of contained energy on a scale that human physiology was not built to process neutrally but had learned, over years of working near it, to integrate without alarm. I had always found it grounding. I found it grounding now. "This works," Oscar said carefully, not looking at me. "The data will be unambiguous." Yes. There is no interpretation of a clean bilateral measurement that fits the standard collapse model. Correct. The result will need to be distributed immediately, or they can. I have a distribution list prepared. I have been maintaining it for 3 years. 412 research nodes across the Concord, human, Vorathi, Drelhari, Kethal, mixed species. The moment we have clean data, I send the complete package simultaneously. Proof, the predictive geometry, the bridge measurement, the anomaly data from the past 8 months, every node at once. There is no mechanism in the Concord legal framework for suppressing a result that is already in 412 archives simultaneously. The effort required to erase it from that many independently administered systems would take years and would generate the exact kind of noise they are trying to avoid. And, Nick, once the proof is public and corroborated, suppressing it is impossible. Harming me or anyone connected to me becomes a political problem of a different order of magnitude entirely. Their leverage dissolves at the moment the distribution completes. The rational choice at that point is to release him quietly and issue a statement about the Concord's commitment to scientific inquiry, which they will word in a way that presents their defeat as an expression of their values. Oscar was quiet for a moment. "Then you've thought about the statement they'll issue." "I've been thinking about it for 6 hours. It's the detail that tells me I have them correctly modeled. They will not be graceless about this. They are not graceless people. They are people who took your son. Yes, both things are true simultaneously." He looked at me. "You know, in 23 years, don't." I was going to say something genuine. "I know, save it. We have 27 minutes. We watched the clock. The bridge cycled through its preparation sequence. The containment field, stepping through the Calig brain states that Oscafor had spent 7 hours programming into the bilateral configuration. The facility was quiet at this hour. Skeleton crew, automated monitoring, no other researchers present. The universe was doing as it always does, everything at once. 0412. The bridge pulsed, not the usual cycle pulse. A different quality of vibration, deeper, more deliberate, as if the instrument was doing something it had been designed to do but had never been asked to do before. Oscar's hands moved across the measurement array readouts. Data cascaded across 6 display panels simultaneously, and it was not the edge noise anomaly signatures he had been accumulating for 8 months. Clear, structured, bilateral and symmetric. A decoherence event, measured on both sides of its own split point. At the exact instant of separation, each branch registering on its own channel, with the complementary patterning that my predictive geometry had said it would have, and that the standard collapse Smithsonian had said was impossible to observe, because the moment of observation was the moment of collapse, and you could not observe both sides of a collapse, because there was only ever one side, 2 sides. Oscar stared at the panels for a long time. His hands were still on the array. He said nothing for what I estimate was 40 seconds, which for Oscar was geological. Then very quietly he said, "It's clean." "Yes, Sebastian." He looked at me. In 23 years I had seen Oscar surprised perhaps 4 times. This was one of them. "It's completely clean, I know. This is..." He stopped. He looked at the panels. He looked at me. He said, the thing I had been waiting, in one form or another, for 20 years to hear him say, and he said it with the tone of a man who has just discovered that the map he was trained on does not cover the full extent of the territory. "You were right." I sent the distribution package at 0417, 412 nodes, the complete proof. The predictive geometry equations, the 8 months of anomaly data from Oscar's archive, and the bilateral bridge measurement with full calibration documentation. I watched the confirmation receipts arrive on the secondary terminal, each node acknowledging receipt, each archive logging the package. 4 minutes and 11 seconds for all 412 confirmations to complete. I watched everyone. Then I set down the terminal, and I told Oscar to go get some sleep, and he looked at me with the expression he has when he knows I am right, but finds it undignified to say so, and he went. I sat in the office alone, with the bridge humming and the containment field cycling in the 6 display panels, still showing the bilateral measurement data. Outside the window, the station was starting its slow rotation toward the system's star, and the light changed on the accelerator ring below, the silver white of station night, giving way to the particular yellow gold of the star at this distance, filtering through the observation dome, 3 levels up and catching the edge of the ring, and making it look, briefly, like something from an older kind of story. I thought about Nick, wherever he was. I thought about the paper seed pod, which I did not know about yet. I would learn about it later, standing in the transit hub, watching him pull it out of his pocket, with the careful pride of a boy who had made something new, but which existed in some branch that was now, as of 4 minutes ago, the one I was in. I thought about the 8-year-old version of him who had said, in the car on the way to the transport hub, that the information version and the color version of a thing are both real at the same time, and don't cancel each other out. He had been right. He had been right in the specific way that children are sometimes right. Not by reasoning their way to an answer, but by intuiting the shape of a territory they have not yet been given the language to map. Comm unit chimed at AO631. Different voice. Formal register. Institutional cadence. The kind of Vorathi communication that comes from a speaker representing something larger than themselves. Professor Vidich. Your son is being returned to Gina Station. He will arrive at the Central Transit Hub at 1100 hours. Trust you will appreciate the Concord's commitment to the integrity of ongoing scientific inquiry. I have replayed that message many times. The last sentence is the detail I always return to, not for its dishonesty, which is complete and uncomplicated, but for its precision. They had reframed their defeat as a principle. They had taken the moment when their leverage collapsed and recast it as evidence of their values. It was, in its way, exact. The statement of a civilization that understood that the story it told about itself was as important as the events that actually occurred, and which had the presence of mind to start telling a better story approximately 4 minutes after the worst story had become impossible. I found it, and still find it, genuinely impressive. Nick arrived at the transit hub at 1100 as stated. He was unharmed. See, he was slightly sunburned on the back of his neck in the way that fair-skinned children get sunburn in pressurized corridor environments with suboptimal UV filtering, which told me he had been outside for significant portions of his time away, which was consistent with his having been held somewhere with access to an exterior corridor or surface. He was full of information about local bird life and Vorathi botanical classification systems, and the specific way that one of the Vorathi minders, who apparently had a name he could not pronounce, and had given himself the nickname Finch for Nick's convenience, had spent 2 afternoons teaching him the basics of paper folding. He showed me the paper seed pod in the transit hub, holding it out on his palm, with the careful pride of a boy presenting a proof. Cream-colored administrative paper, folded with mathematical precision, into a shape that resembled a curled seed from one of the engineered tree species that grew in Jenna Station's garden corridors. I held it in my hands for a moment. I felt, in that moment, the particular sensation that I had described in the theoretical sections of my proof and had never experienced from the inside until now. The collapse. The wave function of the previous 12 hours, which had contained simultaneously the branch where Nick came home and the branch where he did not, collapsing cleanly into the single branch, where I was standing in a transit hub holding a paper seed pod, while my son stood in front of me, waiting to see what I would say. Kept the paper seed pod. It is on my desk. It is there as I write this. The scientific reception to the proof was initially contested. The Vorathi Academy of Theoretical Science issued a formal statement describing the bilateral bridge measurement as a probable calibration artifact, which was precisely what I had expected, and had written a 15-page technical rebuttal for in advance of their issuing it, which I released simultaneously. 41 human physicists signed a public letter of support within 48 hours. Oscar held a press conference in which he stood at a podium for 2 hours and described in precise technical detail exactly how the bilateral array had been configured, exactly what decisions had been made, and why, exactly what the resulting data showed, and what alternative interpretations had been considered and excluded. He answered every question without a hedge or a qualifier. This was characteristic of him, and I think I mattered more than the 41 signatures. Because the 41 signatures were support, and what Oscar provided was testimony, and those are different things. Within 6 weeks, the bilateral measurement had been independently replicated at 3 other facilities. Within 4 months, it had been replicated 11 times, including once at a Vorathi-operated installation in the Outer Systems, which issues its results in a paper whose conclusions were phrased with such extreme caution and qualification that it read as ambiguous to anyone who was not reading it carefully, and which was, to anyone reading it carefully, a complete confirmation. The Vorathi Academy issued a second statement. It described the accumulated results as significant and deserving of continued rigorous study, which is the Vorathi institutional equivalent of a public concession. I have been told this by people who spend their professional lives reading Vorathi institutional communications, and I believe them. Oscar was promoted to Senior Director of the Bridge Research Program. He accepted the promotion with the pragmatic grace of a man who has decided that position is more useful than purity, and who is at peace with that decision. Twice a week, he argues. I argue back. We are, I think, both doing better work than we were doing when we agreed about everything, which was never. Nick started asking about the many worlds interpretation. He had heard me mention it during the crisis, and had the 8-year-old's unerring instinct for the thing that is being discussed in a different room. I explained it to him the way I explain things to people who do not have the mathematical background, but have the instinct. Every time you make a choice, both choices happen. In different branches, both of them are real. He thought about this for a while. Then he said, "So there's a branch of me that didn't go to camp?" "Yes." "Is he okay?" "I think so," I said. "In that branch, nothing much happened." He thought about that. Then, "Which branch is this one? The one where you came back?" He nodded, the small satisfied nod of someone who had already been running this theory and had just received the confirmation they needed. He picked up his paper seed pod from the kitchen table, where he had been keeping it, and went to do his homework. And I sat at the table for a while after he left and felt the weight of all the branches I had held open, simultaneously pressing, and then lifting, pressing and lifting, the way a tide presses against a structure, and recedes and presses again without the structure moving. The Concord investigation into the incident is ongoing. It is slow and procedurally careful, and conducted in a framework that was built for trade disputes and territorial negotiations, and which does not map cleanly onto what actually happened, which was a civilization using the infrastructure of an academic partnership to suppress a scientific result that threatened the epistemological foundations on which that civilization's self-image depended. I appear at the hearings when asked. I say what I know. I answer the follow-up question. They always ask the follow-up question. But how did you know which choice was real? And I tell them, I didn't. I held both. I let the experiment run. The Vorathi built a trap for a creature that chose. They built a binary, a deadline, a cost, and a reward. And they waited for me to collapse the wave function and stay there. They built it well. It was a good trap by every metric available to them, which is to say by every metric their physics and their civilization had ever needed to apply to the problem of managing threats. What they did not know, what they could not know, built as they are on 2 centuries of single universe determinism, is that the threat management protocol assumes its target is the same kind of machine they are. A machine that, when faced with 2 possibilities, eliminates one and proceeds with the other. A machine that cannot hold a contradiction without resolving it. A machine for whom the uncertainty is the problem. For me, the uncertainty was not the problem. The uncertainty was the medium I had been working in for 40 years. I was comfortable there. I had built a career there. I had built a proof there that the universe itself works exactly that way. That holding 2 contradictory possibilities simultaneously and refusing to resolve them until the maximum amount of information is available is not a cognitive limitation, or a failure of decisiveness, but the most accurate possible description of what physical reality actually does. They caught, in the end, the wrong species. That is the whole of it. That is what I tell the panels when they ask how I knew which choice to make, which path to take, which outcome I was moving toward. I was not moving toward an outcome. I was moving through the space between outcomes, collecting information until the space collapsed around me and left me stand somewhere specific with my son's paper seed pod in my hand and the data on 6 display panels and the proof distributed to 412 nodes simultaneously. I looked at the data. The data was clean. That was enough.